Hi everyone, my name is Sai Menon and I'm the founder of Be Anomalous. Beyond that, I'm a mother of a 4-year-old boy, and the reason why I started Be Anomalous is because there are a lot of us who feel like we're in between. Whether it's with expectations, whether it's culturally in between, or whether in whatever way you feel like you're in between, not really belonging into any certain community. And that is one of the reasons why I started Be Anomalous, where I talk to people who seem like they might be in between but really thriving and being able to adapt into whatever circumstance they are in and be able to achieve what their true dream is. And with this platform, I want to be able to give people the opportunity to follow and follow their dreams and follow the path that they truly wish that they would be able to do that. And I like to provide the people and inspiration and also the resources that you require to be able to achieve your dreams. So please subscribe, please like, and please follow us, and also comment for what kind of resources that would help you to be able to further your path or further your dream. So let's grow this community together. Thank you so much for watching and tuning in to Be Anomalous.
Yeah, definitely. I used to say I eat rejection for breakfast. I spoke to 200 investors before someone invested in us.
Early on, someone had advised me for fundraising and was a women exec, that said that like when you're going for fundraising, just take a man in the room so that it's easier.
We ended up being one of the first, if not the first sole female owned and operated business to exit in the wine space, which is pretty crazy. I would say, first of all, conviction but humility are really important, and there's a fine line between conviction and delusion. I think sometimes being humble enough to know that you don't know everything, but also knowing when to stop listening to other people, because again, if you're a founder, you're doing something in a way it hasn't been done before, and so your naivete might also be part of your edge. And I'm a builder, I'm not a refiner, and I'm not an optimizer, right? I think ultimately the biggest thing I would do differently is just really not lose sight of taking care of myself. And I think a lot of founders fall into that trap. And that's something that I've spent a lot of time really learning how to do all over again. It's two different breeds of lonely, I would say. When you are a founder, especially when you're a sole founder and you don't have someone to share the burden of responsibility with, it's really, people don't necessarily understand what it takes to be ultimately responsible for that level of risk, right?
Welcome back to Be Anomalous, the podcast for the misfits, the trailblazers, the cultural disruptors, and anyone bold enough to carve their own path. I'm Sai Menon, and today's guest is someone who didn't just build a brand, she built a cultural movement. Alix Peabody is the founder and former CEO of Bev, the canned wine brand that disrupted the alcohol industry with its unapologetically bold identity, female-forward storytelling, and community-driven approach. What started as an unconventional idea eventually became one of the most recognizable lifestyle beverage brands in the country, leading to a successful acquisition and exit. But Alix's story goes beyond the startup headlines. Before Bev, she worked at Bridgewater, moved across countries at a young age, spoke multiple languages, and constantly found herself drawn toward building things that challenged the status quo. And in this conversation, we get into the real side of entrepreneurship. The rejection, the pressure, the loneliness, the burnout, and what happens after you sell the company you gave everything to. This episode is raw, honest, and deeply insightful for anyone navigating ambition, identity, and the courage to build differently. If you've ever felt like you want to build something or follow that unconventional path, this conversation will really hit home. So let's get into it. I'm so excited to have you, Alix. It's such a pleasure. I've been really looking forward to chatting with you and just getting to know you.
Yes, likewise. I'm excited.
So, for someone who doesn't know you, which I don't think should be the case, but how would you introduce yourself?
Oh my gosh. I mean, my name is Alix. I was formerly the founder of Bev. I am the eldest of five siblings, which is something that matters to me a lot.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's a lot of learning. Like five siblings, and you're the eldest, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I have four younger siblings, but there are five of us, which
Oh,
is crazy.
wow.
And a bunch of them actually worked at Bev, which is a fun
Oh,
little.
yeah. I was reading, like when I was doing my research, I felt like it was sort of like a family business in some way.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, at the beginning of any startup, right, it's kind of interesting because at the beginning of any company, the only people that are really um, believe in you are the ones that know you, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you're first starting out. So we ended up working with a fair amount of family, which was a good time.
Okay, so let's go back to that. Like, how was your relationship while growing up with your siblings? And then just sort of, did you always think that you were going down the entrepreneurial path and you're going to work together as siblings? Just tell us a little
Yeah,
bit about your upbringing.
I mean, yeah, definitely. So I was raised in New York, in the city. We had a three-bedroom apartment with five kids and two parents, and my
Oh,
grandmother lived upstairs. So we were in close quarters a lot of the time, and me and my siblings are very, very close. We always have been. And I think, in terms of the entrepreneurial path, I think I always had it in me a little bit. Like when we were young, during the summers, I would organize this big fake news thing that was like our little kids SNL, and we would film it all summer and stuff like that. So I've always been sort of a mover and a shaker in certain regards. When I was in middle school, I started a literary magazine. And then when I was in high school, I actually went to four different high schools in three different countries. I spent my freshman year in France, then back in New York, and then I lived in Italy for a year. So I'm fluent in both of those languages, which is a fun
oh,
fact.
wow.
Very random. And then I graduated from Andover, actually, out of Massachusetts. So I yeah, when I was abroad, I started a newspaper. I was always very, very active, and in college, started a program that's still running today at Dartmouth called Smart Women Securities, where basically it taught young women about finance and investing and stuff like that. So it's always been part of my DNA, I would say.
Wow, you've moved around a lot, and I feel
Yes.
like you've had so much exposure, right?
Yes.
At
Yeah. I
such
mean,
an early
definitely
age.
at an early age, it definitely made me think out of the box, generally speaking. I didn't really grow up with rigid thinking, and there are certain things that happen too when you're a young person and you study abroad, especially the first time I did it, I was 13 and then I was
Mhm.
16. So pretty young. And when you do that, you have to learn how to make relationships without even speaking a language. So you really have to understand, you learn to make friends with people easily when you're moving around like that. You have to figure out how to ask for a toothbrush if you're missing one and things like that at a very early age, in a language that you don't know. So I think that also helped make me a little bit more outgoing.
Yeah, and it makes sense because I was always thinking like, to start something like Bev, which is so unconventional and it's not the traditional thing that you would see. So to be able to start something like that, you have to see things different. And I
Yeah.
think the fact that you had so much exposure that was sort of ingrained within you that, things can be different. Like, you sort of go through the traditional path of like seeing things in a certain way. But I feel like for you at an early stage, it was all uh, going up towards building dev.
Yeah, and outside of my comfort zone all the time, right? And I do think
Yeah.
you have to, any entrepreneur who's doing something, by the very nature of being an entrepreneur, you're doing something that hasn't been done before necessarily, or a brand that hasn't been built before, a story that hasn't been told before. So, there is a lot of adventure in it that you need to be
Yeah.
ready for.
So, how, like, what was your first job like? And then how did you kind of like your career path towards leading towards Bev?
Yeah. Well, my very first job was working in a Italian cafe. I was a barista and a waitress.
Oh,
Did all that kind of random stuff. But My first job out of school, I worked at a hedge fund called Bridgewater outside of New York. I interned there and then I worked there for about 3 years afterwards. And after that, I moved to the West Coast. I really wanted to be sort of in San Francisco, Silicon Valley area. I wanted to be around the entrepreneurs, and I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to make that work. But I ended up taking a job as an executive headhunter because I figured that it would be my job to meet people in a city that I had never been to before. I moved there sight unseen. I had never been. So I was just ready to be surrounded by the entrepreneurial culture for a change. And that ended up being a really great decision because then when I went on and started Bev, I knew a lot of the venture funds. I had a pretty big network of entrepreneurs and people to lean on and ask questions to.
Wow. So without knowing that you were going to start something, you were actually building the foundation right over there, right?
Yeah. And I kind of always knew I wanted to start something, but I didn't know what, when, or how,
So how did you lead to Bev? How did that come about? The idea?
So this is very random, but after when I was in San Francisco, I had some health problems. I've told the story before of I started throwing parties to raise money to freeze my eggs because that was something that I had to do. I had reproductive health issues. And, I really loved, it was very different from Dartmouth culture in terms of like the frat scene and the male owned social spaces and stuff like that. So I really wanted to do something that was centered around social spaces and ones that were more owned by women. And that was something that the parties that I was throwing were really good at, where the vibes were just different. I don't know how else to explain it. And then originally I actually thought I wanted to build like a media events company. And so I applied very randomly to USC's master's in screenwriting and production. And I thought maybe I'll build like a Shondaland. And so I moved down to LA, went to the USC master program. And when I was there, I kind of realized that a lot of how the entertainment industry works, it's a lot of, you work on a lot of things, tell a lot of stories that don't necessarily get told. I didn't want what I had to say to be dependent on whether some suit in some office in West Hollywood liked it or not. So I started thinking about different things. And at the time, it was kind of the rise of Bumble and Glossier and Outdoor Voices. And, and I kind of found myself thinking a lot of the people who are telling stories right now are actually brands. And is there a way for me to build a brand as a vehicle for a story? And as I was thinking more about it, I realized that, a lot of what I wanted to be able to talk about was drinking culture, party culture, all of these, how we socialize, how we see each other in those types of settings, and do it in a way that was inclusive and warm and not man-hating and friendly and all of that kind of stuff. And so I figured maybe I should look into being in the alcohol industry because that's a great place to, if you're in it, you can talk about it. And that was kind of where it all started. And so originally the idea was really to build something, I was thinking like a Red Bull model, like really like a media company fueled by beverage sales. Eventually it didn't fully work out that way because, the alcohol industry is very complicated. And there's a lot of operations that go into it and stuff like that. But I do think that because there was such a focus on the brand and the story and what we stood for before there was actually a product, that ended up being really beneficial to the overall company.
Wow. I mean, it was such a whirlwind of a ride that you got.
Yeah, the long and winding road. Sure.
Yeah. But even Bev, I feel like it's such a challenging industry, especially, in the bro culture that's there. And you were really trying to stand out and create something niche for women. Women friendly, I would say, like female friendly space. How did you navigate that? And what were did you have discouragement when you started off?
Yeah, definitely. I used to say I eat rejection for breakfast. I spoke to like 200 investors before someone first invested in us. Also, alcohol is a difficult industry to get financing for because it there are a lot of funds that have endowments or whatever, and so they have things called vice clauses where they're not allowed to invest in alcohol. So it was difficult at first for sure, and I think the industry itself is a really hard one, and a lot of what you see in terms of the brands that are out there, they're masculine, they're broy, browns, silvers, blues, blacks. And that's really systemic. It comes from all the way back from Prohibition, right? When Prohibition was lifted, all of the people that were in charge were obviously men. And, and they were the ones that already had all of the infrastructure to distribute, to create, because they were doing it anyway during Prohibition times. And so, when you get into the industry, you realize I was usually, or my team was usually the only women in the room for a while.
Early on, someone had advised me for fundraising that, and was a women exec, that said that, like when you're going for fundraising, just take a man in the room so that it's easier. Did you feel that? And I was just like,
yeah,
exactly.
Advice, but there were definitely
this is like
times...
someone that I really looked up to, and I was just like, why should I? Because I'm the one who's doing all the work. Why should I take another person? Even if he's not involved.
Yes and no. There were definitely times that I took men to distributor meetings and stuff like that, so that there was a little bit of balance there. And we did have some a couple guys that worked at Bev. It was predominantly women, but fundraising wise, I would say I don't think it's totally necessary, but just know that it is it is harder for women. It just is, and those biases tend to be pretty implicit. They're not things that people necessarily would think that they have, but they kind of do. But I fundraised by myself for the entire thing, and did so successfully. But you just have to have a lot of hustle, and one of the things I think, more than like taking an actual man, I would say you kind of have to think as best you can with a male gaze and a male attitude. And that sounds kind of weird, but I think, one of the things that really unlocked for me was when I stopped thinking of fundraising as something that, was a favor people were doing for me, or I was, when I stopped being so anxious about whether they were going to like it, and also separating me from the deal. So, you go in and it's so vulnerable when you go in and you have your idea and it's really tied intrinsically to who you are. And, one of the things that I tell people is you really have to think about it like it's, the investors are playing football and deals are the balls, right? That are being tossed around. And so separating yourself from it a little bit, and having a little bit of detachment, and knowing that they're looking at it as a deal. And then also, saying, I'm potentially sitting on a pot of gold. I'm going to work extremely hard to try to make everyone money here. It doesn't always work out that way, but I am the thing standing between you and, the potential upside of this investment, rather than please take me on, please invest in me. There's a mindset shift, I think, that serves people really well when they're fundraising.
I think that's also how a man would take it, right? Like they have the confidence to be able to like, I'm the one who's doing you a favor. And I think women have to just shift that mindset and be able to see it the same way, because I think we are programmed in a way that we're always sort of, I don't want to say subservient, but in some ways.
Totally.
Always,
totally. I think that's fair, and a little more cautious. Women statistically, are judged on their experience and performance, whereas men tend to be more judged on their potential. And so, I think having that energy shift and really focusing on, what is my energy and attitude when I'm coming into these meetings, how, and thinking about it a little bit more detached and a little more logically, and, being able to have those conversations up front and easily about numbers. What size checks do you guys write? This is kind of the valuations we're looking at. Women tend to be less comfortable at first doing that. But when you talk that way, you also show a level of, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of advanced thinking in terms of how deals are, how they're made. and how the industry works.
I mean, that goes back to like every role that you were playing, right? Not just in fundraising, but just building, because you were building in a male dominated industry.
Yeah.
So it was just in every aspect you had to be like, you have to show that persona that I have to be taken seriously, right?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I think so. And I think, different industries require different things. I think fundraising sort of requires one mentality in terms of getting buy-in from our distributors and retailers and stuff like that. That kind of required a bit of a different approach sometimes, where, understand your audience, understand who you're dealing with, and understand your goals very, very specifically, and that will help you know what the approach is in terms of how you're interacting with people, because everything at the end of the day is some form of sales. You're either selling a part of your company, you're selling a job opportunity when you're recruiting, or you're selling into a distributor or a retailer, that kind of thing. So really kind of nailing down what the audience is.
Going back to that, like I think I'd read somewhere that knowing your why is very important, especially when you're starting something, because it's going to be hard. You walked away from multiple ideas before you went into Bev, and obviously Bev was so difficult to start off with. But what kept you going? Like, and you realized that this is it, and this is where it's going to, because but you started with a media company, you started with so many different ideas, but then you stuck with Bev.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I put myself in a situation where my back was really against a wall, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that for everyone. And it's interesting now, right? Because as I think about what's next for me and, in my new ventures, I have a very different relationship with what I'm doing. Whereas before I was very much in fight or flight a lot of the time. It was survival a lot of the time. I think, my team really made me stick with it. My passion for what we stood for, the change we were making in an industry. We ended up being one of the first, if not the first, sole female owned and operated business to exit in the wine space, which is pretty crazy. So I think really having a connection, to why I was doing what I was doing, and also who I was doing it with, was really important.
So how did you like figure out the who? If I'm not wrong, when you started off, it was just you.
It was just me, and then my cousin was my first hire, who was our creative director. And I wanted somebody obviously in-house, and I needed somebody doing mock-ups and helping me with investor decks and all of that kind of stuff. And then, I'm very much a gut intuition person when it comes to hiring. We took some risks on people that hadn't necessarily been in roles before, who were green and out of school, and those ended up being extremely rewarding because they were aligned with the mission, really hungry, excited, and I think everyone is better off for having, in their lives in general, for having worked there, which is a really nice feeling. So a lot of the who is gut, it's intuition. It's also, I think, I had a background in recruiting, so I understood that these things also take time, and recruiting is a long process. It can take years to recruit the right person, but even if you know who that right person is at the beginning, it might not be the right stage, or and so keeping in touch, keeping updated, and making sure that that you have the vision for who you want, what you want your team to look like, and building that out over time is important.
How did you decide what your role would be, and like the strength and weaknesses that early on, to be able to create this role for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if you're familiar with Bridgewater. Have you heard of it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Bridgewater is a place, for those who are listening who might not know, that was founded by Ray Dalio, who wrote Principles, amongst some other books, and Principles is really how it works at Bridgewater. And so there are certain kind of people say it's kind of crazy things. There's radical candor. You have baseball cards as an employee where people rank your strengths and weaknesses and whatever. So I was no stranger to my strengths and weaknesses, just from having worked there for quite a while. I was very familiar with what I was good at, what I wasn't good at, where the holes were. That's part of, honestly, one of the gifts of having worked at Bridgewater. One of the gifts that it gave me was that I was no stranger to what those things were. So I knew, and one of the things that Ray says in the principles too is build your machine, he calls it, and what that means is literally like your people and your processes to fit your goals, and know what that needs to look like against your own strengths and weaknesses. So I would say that was a strength of mine, was recruiting the right people in the right places and knowing out of the gates what I would be good at and not good at. But I will say that, a CEO fundamentally has 3 jobs at the end of the day. And that's true across, across everything. It's making sure the company's capitalized, setting the vision, and recruiting the right people. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Yeah. I think you had that superpower from the beginning where hiring the right people, I think that's a core strength that you need to have, especially as you're growing. And another interesting thing that you bring up is, do you think Bev would be as successful if you didn't have that experience and you just started off Bev right out of college?
Oh, man. I don't think so. I think, the boot camp of Bridgewater, it also taught me a lot of work ethic, right? Like I lived in New York, commuted out to Connecticut every day, was up at 6, got home at midnight sometime, really grinded and worked really hard. And so, and it helps me really learn how to think. It's different. Whereas a lot of when you go into consulting or banking and stuff, you learn specific skills a lot of the time and frameworks and stuff like that, but you're not necessarily learning how do you build your own frameworks? How do you build your own, ways of thinking? And that's really what Bridgewater does well. So.
Yeah, the reason I asked this question is because, a lot of early stage students, they try to drop out and start working on something. So like coming from entrepreneurs, I think it's really important to know what you're good at. And if that's something that, like, what advice would you have for someone who is starting out something right out of the college? Right out of college.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, conviction, but humility are really important. And there's a fine line between conviction and delusion. I think sometimes, being humble enough to know that you don't know everything, but also knowing when to stop listening to other people. Because again, if you're a founder, you're doing something in a way it hasn't been done before. And so your naivete might also be part of your edge, Yeah. And the other thing I would say is surround yourself as fast, as quickly as possible with the most experienced, advisors and that you can. I think that's really important and makes a world of difference. I did that right out of the gates.
How did you go about the branding of Bev? It's such colorful, it's so colorful.
Yeah.
It's so different and unique. It takes some sort of confidence to be able to stand out like that, right? Like you're making something that's completely unique and not seen before.
Yeah, totally. People ask me this a lot, and I was just like, look, it was just my favorite colors. And, I had certain things in mind. I wanted Bev to be, your friend. So I wanted it to be a woman's name, but I also didn't want it to be necessarily someone and I knew when I was trying to think up names, I knew, that I wanted it to be like a strong name. So I wanted consonants. I had specific things in my head. And then, the color of the can itself was the color of my accent wall in my bedroom when I first moved to San Francisco. That was my favorite color. And so I really wanted my personality to shine through. And that was pretty much it. There was no branding firm. It was just me and my cousin, sitting over Photoshop, tweaking things here and there, and stuff like that.
That's really good lesson for especially someone who's starting off in the CPG brand to be able to know that you can do this on your own. You don't need to hire like a huge branding agency and spend lots of money.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I think, it also made us think differently than a lot of what was out there, and it made it authentic. You know, it was real. It was this, you know, it was the stuff that I just loved.
When did you realize that this was beyond a brand? Because you created a movement with Bev. When did when was that aha moment that you realized that, oh my God, this is huge?
Well, that is very nice of you to say. To be honest, I'm like still having those moments. You know, there are certain things where someone will tell me that they, you know, send me a picture that they saw it in a random place, which, by the way, I love when people do that. So it makes me really happy. Or, you know, or you'd see the data and you'd be like, whoa, we've actually moved a lot of product. And, you know, since I exited the brand, it's continued to grow. And so there are times that I'm still having those moments. But I think, to be honest, I didn't really realize the magnitude of, you know, of what had happened with it until I was out of it. Because you're just so in it in a day to day, and you know, you tend to be focused on the problems a lot, and so it can be hard to stay grounded in also the successes and, you know, and the exciting things.
Enjoy that. Yeah, I mean, bringing up the exit, did you always, like, I think now in the VC industry, there is that term of exit and knowing what you want the company to, you know, eventually where are you going with it? Did you always have that vision and plan that you wanted to exit from the start?
No, I definitely did not. You know, I built it in the beginning in my mind to, you know, to do and to last. And I, you know, I had a bunch of ideas for how to expand the brand and stuff like that. What ended up happening, which I think happens a lot, is you get into it and you start to get to scale, and it goes from a brand, or it goes from a company where it's vision and it's branding and it's marketing and stuff like that, to becoming a very operationally heavy business. And I'm a builder, I'm not a refiner, and I'm not an optimizer, right? And so and I know that about myself. So I don't, you know, it gets to a point where so much of the business is reliant on, you know, margin hunting and cost cutting and efficiencies and all of these kinds of things that, you know, my team was great at, but it wasn't ultimately my passion. And I also knew that the way that the industry functions in adult beverage, it's extremely hard without a massive amount of capital to get to a point where you can scale it beyond, you know, beyond your handful of retailers or whatever it is, because you have to think about every store that you have. You need people on the ground who can physically go in and out of that store and stuff like that. So you need either really strong partnerships and also like a really strong ground team, and that's really expensive to build. And so it got to a point where I just realized that we couldn't efficiently take it to the next level. You know, we needed to really kind of let it, as I say, go off to college and stand on its own 2 feet a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great analogy where you're like, I mean, it's your baby and you're like letting it go into college,
Exactly.
and then just like letting it grow. But it's, for the longest time, you've been just working on this for so long. And how is that transition? It's hard, right? Like,
it's really hard. Yeah, it's really hard. And I don't think it's talked about enough, because you go from one day, literally overnight, your phone's constantly blowing up, you're on calls, you're managing your team, to, you know, my phone barely rang for a year, and it was very quiet. And I had to kind of, and I also was at a place with it, you know, emotionally and mentally, where I needed a bit of that separation. I needed time to reground myself, to, you know, to really kind of figure out who I was outside of it, because it can become very enmeshed and it creeps up on you, you know. And I was ready to be able to like sleep through the night.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, like everything that you just said, it's really hard, especially, I mean, in some way for your mental health, you need that, but it's also that transition, it's really hard. Like you said, it's a simple thing from getting used to the fact that your phone is now quiet, which is a good thing, but also getting used to that
It's
new
jarring. It's
change.
very jarring. Yeah. It is. It's a shock to the system for sure.
Yeah. So if you were to go back and start Bev again, how would you do it differently?
So many ways. I mean, there's so much. Well, differently, I don't know, because I'm grateful for where I am right
Yeah.
now, and I'm grateful for all of the things I've learned, the relationships that I built, which are, making deciding what I want to do next a lot easier. I think there were a lot of things I just didn't know, but I don't know that, if I went back and did it today, I know those things. So I would obviously do them
Yeah.
differently in terms of, especially really dialing in a lot of the operational stuff, really dialing in your margins, your supply chain, really being able to analyze demand better, a lot of that kind of stuff. But I think ultimately the biggest thing I would do differently is just really not lose sight of taking care of myself. And I think a lot of founders fall into that trap. And that's something that I've spent a lot of time really like learning how to do all over again. And, not sacrificing my health, not sacrificing my sleep, things like that. And having a life outside of it, I think is important, because you do get burned out, eventually. And by the end, I would say I was very, very burned out.
I think a lot of founders have been talking about that, like how they, sacrifice so much of their life for the startup, and then, going out and just kind of figuring out who they are. But do you think it's that sacrifices that make the company a success? Because I feel like all of the successful founders say that. And do you think it's possible to kind of do both, and you can still take care of yourself and still create that successful company?
I do think it's possible. I think when you're hearing that, it's a lot of the time first time founders. I think second time
Yeah.
founders approach things very differently. And I think there are some things that would have worked out differently or better if I were a little bit more detached, because, probably would have been able to see things a bit more clearly. Sometimes you're not like in the emotional muck of
Yeah.
it. So I think that, it takes a toll. It definitely takes a toll, but a lot of the people I know who are on round 2 or round 3 approach it differently. And I think that there's an element of just getting caught up in, in your first time doing it, where you're drinking out of a fire hose all the time.
Yeah. How did your relationship with your team change? And a lot of it is your family members. So how did that go about? You know,
Yeah, I mean, it changed pretty dramatically in some cases, and others, not so much. Um, but I think everybody, especially the people who'd been there a long time, everybody kind of needed a break.
mm,
There were a lot of people, I think, by the end, who were pretty burnt out and just needed some time to reset and stuff like that. And the other thing about being a founder is that, you by very nature as a person are going to be associated with a thing, and so
yeah,
I think, and that was hard for me too, where, people needed, I think by the end, a break from, or, some people like needed a break from the company, and that also meant a break from me. And they couldn't necessarily separate the two, and I had to honor and respect that, and
yeah,
understand it, and be okay with being kind of lonely for a hot minute, which I think
yeah.
happens to a lot of people as well. But for the most part, things are fine. And I have some former employees who are working together again at new companies, and they'll text me about it and be like, guess what, we just hired so and so. So that's really exciting and good to see.
That's amazing. And it's interesting you bring up the lonely part after being a founder, because it also gets lonely when you are a founder. So
Oh,
it's
for sure.
like, yeah, it's something that I feel like, when are you going to get over that?
Yeah, well, it's two different breeds of lonely, I would say. When you are a founder, especially when you're a sole founder and you don't have someone to share the
Mm,
burden responsibility with, it's really, people don't necessarily understand what it takes to be ultimately responsible for that level of risk, right? And so it's not just the work that you're doing. It's not just the hours that you're putting in, or, the time you spend. It's that ultimately the founder is taking on the burden of the risk, and they're taking on the responsibility of other people's capital and stuff like that. So there are pressures, and many founders, I mean, myself definitely included, try to do the best they can to shield the team from those external pressures because it's distracting, right? And so a lot of what you're doing alone, and you're taking that burden on your shoulders alone. Whereas, people on the team, they might be working hard. They might be working even longer hours. They're sacrificing a lot as well, but it's a different emotional buy-in, and it's a different level of attachment and risk ultimately.
Did you have any hard conversations, especially, I know you said that it was easier for you working with your own like family members, but then when it's in the business.
I wouldn't say it's always easier because, they will tell you what they think, no holds bars or whatever that phrase is. And, and they'll go toe to toe with you, with a lot more freedom than someone who,
an employee. Yeah. So did you have to have like hard discussions or like hard decisions that you have to make?
Totally. I mean, definitely. There are times when also it doesn't matter if someone's family or not family or like family because they've been there a long time.
Yeah.
Sometimes the company outgrows someone's skill set, and that's a hard conversation. And, the other thing about being, the CEO or founder is a lot of the time people see the glamour, they see some of the PR, they see you at an all hands where you're pumping everyone up, stuff like that. But ultimately, things don't bubble up to you until there are problems, right? So the vast majority of your time, 90%, 80-90% of your time is being spent having the hard conversation, managing the difficult, the places that are going well, you don't worry about too much. You check in, and you see what's going on, you get updated, et cetera, but you don't need to deploy yourself in them. So ultimately, that's a lot of the job, is dealing with the hard conversations, both internally and externally.
But I guess coming from the recruiting background, you already had access to that, right? Like you were doing that in some way.
I mean, recruiting less so, but Bridgewater.
But at least you were part of those conversations, right? Like the hard discussions, like in terms of like firing, hiring. You've seen that in your experience.
For sure. And Bridgewater is a place where hard discussions prevail. So I was not a stranger to it, but ultimately, over time it can fry your system a little bit because you're constantly, in between meetings being like, deep breath, I can handle it. And I've got to center myself, and now I have to like give someone some tough feedback or some tough love, or, things didn't go according to plan, and I have to communicate that with investors who can sometimes be emotional in their responses and stuff like that. So you're just fielding a lot of that most of the time.
So since the exit, how has it been? How are you taking care of yourself? I think that's also really important.
Yeah. I had to rebuild from really the beginning because I was not taking care of myself at all. And so, I started meditating a lot. Pretty much every day I started making sure I was working out. I had to retrain myself how to sleep through the night. Like, no joke. That took probably a year to do that. And there was a period of time where I had to take stuff to help me sleep because my brain would just go until Lord knows what time, and I couldn't fall asleep, right? And making sure I'm getting that sleep, getting outside, getting sunlight. I mean, that sounds silly, but like for real, it matters.
Yeah, it
Um,
does. And you could sometimes forget to do that,
yeah,
especially when you're
totally.
in front of the laptop all day long.
Totally. So, um, things like that. And also, coming to an understanding with myself that not every minute of, like, if you're not feeling it in the moment and you're forcing yourself to do something, but the energy's not there, or you're just not thinking clearly, like, get up. Same with if you're trying to fall asleep and you can't fall asleep, get out of bed, go sit on the couch, read, like, get up, walk around the block, clear your head, really listening to your body and your mind, I think, is really critical.
So I think while you were talking, I was also thinking of your path, because for someone who started their own company and you were essentially the CEO, do you see yourself or ever being able to work for someone else?
Oh, I mean, maybe in the right context, but I don't know that they would want to hire me. Yeah, no, I mean, maybe in the right context, but but I really am a founder at heart, I think, and that's what I love to
Yeah.
do, what I know how to do, and specifically from kind of like stages like 0 to 10. Like, I'm, again, not refiner, not an optimizer, but really just a builder from the
Early
beginning.
stage.
Yeah, early stages. I love it. And and so I think that's where I'll continue to be, at least for a little while, until maybe eventually moving on to like the investment side or something, in which case I'd need to learn from someone at some point or another, probably. So yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, no, I mean,
And
I always feel like with founders, it's hard for them to be employed. I mean, that's the
yeah,
reason why they started something, because
yeah, I
it takes
mean,
a lot of work.
I think that is also, there's a little bit of a myth there, because founders report to someone too. Like,
Yeah,
the
it's a big
people, it's
myth.
easy to forget that founders report to their investors and their board. And there are many tales of a founder who's a CEO getting removed from their own company. That stuff,
Yeah,
that happens, that's real,
yeah.
right? And so I think it's easy to, and on the one hand, I'm like, no, I don't think so. But what I mean more is having the structure of
Yeah, I know.
the
Yeah,
job, more than like, could I do it?
being
Because
employed.
I am going to do it at some point, probably, or, in the sense of reporting to a board, reporting to investors.
No, I think my question was also more so like, the 9 to 5 job. I feel like with founders, that kind of structure is going to be so different because you're always on the go, like you're always
Yeah.
working. So I feel like probably that's why it's always beyond the job per se.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that is important to me, and in whatever I do next, is learning how to turn it off, in terms of, you asked about how to
Mhm.
take care of yourself and mental health, and like learning how to actually turn it off and be like, okay, I've done what I can for today. I'm not gonna worry about it. And keeping yourself level and centered in that way, I think, is really critical, and being able to turn it off, because if you don't, it's a recipe for burnout.
What advice would you have for someone who wants to start something on their own or who wants to take that unconventional path?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's no good time to start, so just start. Second, make sure you have the foundational building blocks in your life before you begin. And by that, I don't mean, I don't even necessarily mean the finances or whatever. I mean, like, what is your morning routine? It's locked in. What is your travel
Yeah.
routine? Because you end up traveling a lot, and that can really disrupt the flow. How are you taking care of yourself? Make sure that those pieces of your life are locked and loaded, and so that they operate like clockwork, so that you don't get to a level of burnout. And then, yeah, I mean, the other thing is that jump in the nutshell up here a little bit, right? Like, you're going to learn as you go. And I've said this to a fair amount of people too. The startup world is in many ways like its own industry. And so the other thing I say is, like, the experience will never be a waste of time. You're going to learn
Mhm.
a lot, and you're going to be in a new ecosystem where within that ecosystem, you're going to meet other founders, you're going to, you'll meet investors at certain points, different partners and stuff. And, if something doesn't work, you're within an ecosystem. I almost liken it to being at like a big, it's obviously the opposite of corporate, but like a big corporate establishment where, people can, and that's true for employees too, of like early stage companies where people can jump from department to department, like once you're kind of in the ecosystem. So, just knowing that, I think also takes a lot of fear away for people sometimes, because it's not like, and it's not like the other stuff isn't going to be there if you eventually want to go back to whatever you were doing before. Chances are it will, but chances are you won't want to go back.
Yeah, usually that's the case.
Yeah.
Before we end, I always end it with, what's your favorite book recommendation and a quote you live by?
Sorry, a goal to live by?
A quote.
A quote.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, good questions. Okay. Book recommendation. The Surrender Experiment.
Oh, I've never heard of that.
Michael Singer. I would say that's a great one. Okay. And that, in the aftermath has helped me a lot in terms of how I think about things and, my role in the universe, so to speak, and how I approach different topics. So I love that book. That's a great one. And a quote to live by. I mean, I have so many, but I guess, you should see my notes app. It's like crazy, but I guess one of the ones that I love is just what my grandfather always used to say, which is, luck falls on the shoulders of those prepared to receive it. So,
oh wow, that's so powerful.
Yeah, I love that. And so I think, always be preparing for that luck to strike, no matter in what area of your life. Right.
Yeah.
So that's the one that I would say.
That's amazing. And on that powerful note, thank you so much, Alix. This was so wonderful. And I learned so much from you. I feel like being a founder is so hard, but you have to keep going, right?
Yes, definitely keep going. But well, thank you so much for having me. It was lovely.
Yeah, thank you.
That was Alix. One thing that stood out to me from this conversation is building something meaningful obviously requires a lot of courage and strength, but sustaining yourself while building that is the real work. I loved how honest Alix was about the parts of entrepreneurship people rarely talk about. The burnout, the loneliness, the identity shifts, and learning how to reconnect with yourself after living in survival mode for so long. And one of the things that stood out was her grandfather's quote: luck falls on the shoulders of those who are prepared to receive it. That line perfectly captures what every single person at Be Anomalous comes to talk about. Preparation, conviction, and trusting your difference enough to keep going, even when the world hasn't validated it. I think that's something that really keeps us going. If this episode resonated with you, please like, share, subscribe, and share it with anyone who is trying to build something outside the box or who needs the courage to be able to do that. Until next time, this is Sai Menon. Be bold, be real, and be anomalous.